Hi, Bray. Oh, she can hear me. So the title of my talk this morning is When the Buddha Refused to Answer. And there are a number of instances in the early text in the Pali Canon when the Buddha just flatly refused to answer a question, even when asked directly. So what do we make of this? I mean, it's generally understood that he refused to answer certain questions that required a response that involved some metaphysical claim that he said he didn't really have any knowledge of. You know, issues that he found were an unnecessary distraction on the path of reducing suffering. Remember that he said, I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the end of suffering. Now, note that he didn't say he taught the end of pain. You know, as Don often reminds us, pain times resistance equals suffering. Or stated another way, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And of course, we all experience pain. We feel physical pain, emotional pain, pain of loss, the list goes on and on. But the suffering from that pain really comes from the second arrow stuff that we pile onto our pain, all the mental ruminations that we use to respond when we experience pain. But one of the key questions in which he refused to answer, um, well, he answered it, but not in a complete way, regarding the presence of a fixed self. You know, in other words, he wanted his followers to work on understanding the concept of non-self and not cling to this notion of a fixed self. He wanted them to figure that out on their own. He didn't want to get bogged down in sort of the minutia, the nuances of that question. And we all know people, sometimes even ourselves, who we've called a big ego. And this is often is this big ego fixed and unchangeable. And typically, if you scratch the surface, we'll see that it's a cover for insecurities that people have where they have to sort of inflate who they are, sort of take on a grandiose sense of self, to cover up a sense of poor self-worth. And our initial reaction to those folks is often to judge them negatively. You know, their brashness, their self-aggrandizement make it hard to see past the exterior and feel compassion for their suffering, or to see how their inflated ego is a barrier to finding some spiritual path which could bring them more peace and less suffering in their lives. You know, they're too busy promoting and protecting an ego and avoiding the shame of having that penetrated to engage in a path, ours or another spiritual path. But many of us find our way to this path when we're suffering because it becomes too much to live with. We don't want to continue suffering. You know, so we start by asking our own questions and pursuing our own answers. Again, not looking to the Buddha for all the answers. He wanted us to look ourselves for our own answers, using the guidance of a teacher, using the teachings, of the Dharma and the community of a Sangha, so that we begin to develop a clarity of vision about our own suffering and the sources of our own suffering. But these answers, as he indicated, aren't coming from some unanswerable pie in the sky types of teachings, because he wasn't about that. You know, he wanted us to ask and answer our own questions using the roadmap that he provided. You know, this is what I love about this tradition. It doesn't give pat answers. It doesn't give, creeds and fixed beliefs that we have to accept. He wants us to find our own answers. And then and only then do we start to see reality as it is, lower the mask of the false self that we've spent our lives hiding behind. And this reflects back on the last two meetings when we talked about the stories that we tell ourselves. And then and only then do we get a taste of the freedom that this practice offers. So the Buddha is quoted in the Dhammapada as having said, quote, "You are your own mainstay, for who else could be your mainstay? With you yourself well trained, you can obtain the mainstay hard to obtain." You are your own mainstay, for who else could be your mainstay? With you yourself well trained, you obtain the mainstay hard to obtain. And when he's close quotes, when he's talking about well trained there, he's talking about exploring the teachings and figuring out whether they fit for our own experience. In other words, our path and our practice on the path makes it possible to reduce our suffering, to penetrate this idea of a fixed self, a self which is ever changing, but which supports us as we go through the process of letting go of challenging thoughts, of challenging habits of the mind, of our past causes and conditions, which so influence our day to day behavior, feelings, sensations, and so forth. I found this interesting. If you look into the Pali Canon, there's a list of 10 questions that the Buddha refused to give an answer to. And they're not totally relevant to the talk today, but I thought they were interesting, so I'm going to share them with you. They're not real long. The questions had to do with these were the questions. Is the world eternal? Is the world not eternal? Is the world finite? Is the world not finite? Is the soul the same as the body? Is the soul one thing and the body another? Does the Buddha exist after death? Does the Buddha not exist after the death? After death, does the Buddha both exist and not exist? After death, does a Buddha neither exist nor does not exist? So those were the 10 questions, what are called the 10 undeclared topics. But you can see there that he's staying away from these sort of metaphysical questions about an afterlife, about whether the world is eternal or not, or finite or infinite. And he really was a pragmatist. You know, so these are questions he would not answer. These statements that he refuses to answer suggest that he's not willing to address these unanswerable questions that may trouble us, but which become a distraction to our path. Okay. You know, questions that don't deal with a specific dharmic issue in our day-to-day lives, questions that have no pragmatic impact on how we live our lives daily. The reason I call what I teach practical dharma is because I don't want it laden with a lot of medical, physical, and unanswerable questions. I want it to be relevant. I want it to be applicable to our day-to-day lives in a very pragmatic way. Now, that's not to say that the Buddha refused to answer all questions. Of course not. He was a brilliant teacher. He answered questions that the monks brought about the Four Noble Truths, about equity, about morality, about the four Brahma Viharas. I mean, all of the kind of practical, pragmatic stuff he willingly answered. But he didn't get bogged down in a lot of unanswerable metaphysical questions. Some of you may know of Stephen Batchelor. He's a British teacher, former monk and author, one of who often reflects on these questions. He wrote a book which was very influential for me early on called Secular Buddhism, or Buddhism Without Beliefs, the subtitle being Secular Buddhism. And he's teaching there, he's offering, and I'm going to give another talk in a few weeks on a specific uh, chunk of his teaching. He's talking about the Buddha's teachings without all the metaphysical trappings. When he says Buddhism without beliefs, the beliefs he's referring to are all the metaphysical beliefs. And he described how Batchelor sort of reframes and describes how the Buddha recognized that numerous conditions, here's causes and conditions, are responsible for our experience. Rejecting these sort of metaphysical explanations in favor of a pragmatic approach to living life in the world in the here and now. You know, don't get bogged down in the other stuff. In other words, for instance, seeing karma as cause and effect, as ye sow, so shall ye reap, not as some more metaphysical notion. Uh, and when Batchelor refers to addressing those 10 undeclared topics, he said, quote, I find the last four topics, those regarding a Buddha after death, as somewhat fishy. My sense is that these were incorporated later to replace the more problematic propositions for traditional Indian Buddhists. In other words, to satisfy the sort of Hindu influenced zeitgeist of those days, that they added those. That was Batchelor's contention. I thought that was interesting. So, but by not answering certain metaphysical arguments in his day, the Buddha provided a template for us to avoid doing so also. In other words, he wants us to keep focused on the practical means of reducing our suffering in the interest of leading a more balanced and joyful life with as little suffering as possible. And this really appealed to me. It continues to appeal to me. I find it refreshing and reassuring, actually, that the Buddha refused to answer these questions. He didn't get distracted. Too many faith traditions, I think, sort of take us down these blind alleys with these fixed beliefs and these metaphysical notions. And so I guess I want to leave you with a thought that we should avoid asking them ourselves and focus instead on the pragmatic teachings, which contribute to the reduction of our own suffering. So that's why the Buddha didn't answer those questions, and I don't prefer to answer them either if asked.